The Chicago Municipal Court buzzed with its usual morning activity. People shuffled in and out, their footsteps echoing across the polished floors as they made their way through security. It was 9:15 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning when Sarah Mitchell walked through the large wooden doors of courtroom 302. Sarah hadn't planned to be here today. As an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune for the past 8 years, she usually spent her mornings chasing leads or typing away at her desk, but a parking ticket from 3 weeks ago had brought her to this crowded courtroom. She was wearing simple blue jeans and a neat white blouse. Comfortable clothes she'd chosen for a day of interviews she had planned after this quick court appearance. The courtroom itself was like any other: rows of wooden benches, the judge's elevated platform, and the American flag standing tall in the corner. Sarah found a spot on one of the back benches, pulling out her phone to check her emails while she waited. Around her, other people whispered nervously or flipped through papers, preparing for their moments before the judge. Judge Robert Henderson entered the courtroom precisely at 9:30 a.m. All rise. The bailiff called out, and everyone stood. The judge, a tall man in his early 60s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, took his seat with an air of authority. He had been presiding over traffic court for 15 years, and his reputation for being strict was well known throughout Chicago. One by one, people stepped forward as their names were called. Sarah watched carefully as the judge handled each case. She noticed how he spoke differently to different people. Some received patient explanations, while others got short, sharp responses. Her reporter's instinct started picking up on patterns, even though she hadn't meant to work today. "Sarah Mitchell," the clerk finally called out. Sarah stood up and walked to the podium. She held her citation in one hand and had prepared a simple explanation about the unclear parking signs that had led to her ticket. But before she could speak, Judge Henderson barely glanced at her and started talking. "Another parking violation," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several people in the courtroom look up. "I see this is your second ticket this year, Ms. Mitchell." "Yes, Your Honor, but if I could explain," Sarah began politely. "The signs are perfectly clear." Judge Henderson cut her off, still not making eye contact as he shuffled through his papers. "This area has been a no-parking zone for 20 years. I don't understand why some people find it so difficult to follow simple rules." Sarah noticed how his tone had changed from the way he had spoken to the previous defendants. She had watched him patiently listen to a white woman explain her situation just minutes before. The contrast was striking. "Your Honor, I have photos showing the sign was partially hidden by tree branches and—" "That will be $300. Judge Henderson interrupted again, finally looking up at her with clear dismissal in his eyes. "Plus $50 court costs. Next case." Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned not by the fine itself, she could afford it, but by the judge's behavior. In the 8 years she had spent investigating stories about corruption, discrimination, and injustice in Chicago, she had developed a keen sense for when something wasn't right. As she walked back to her seat to gather her things, she overheard 2 court officers whispering. "Henderson's in a mood today," one said. "Yeah, but did you see how he treated that lady before? The one with the exact same violation, completely different story," the other replied, not realizing Sarah could hear them. Sarah pulled out her reporter's notebook, she always carried one, and began taking notes. She wrote down the judge's behavior, his words, his tone, and the reactions of others in the courtroom. What had started as a simple parking ticket was turning into something else entirely in her mind. As she left the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her phone and called her editor at the Chicago Tribune. "Mark, I might have something interesting here," she said quietly, walking down the courthouse steps. "I need access to the court's public records for the past few years. All of Judge Henderson's cases." The morning sun was bright as Sarah walked to her car. She had come to court expecting to pay a fine and leave. Instead, she had found what might be her next big story. Sometimes, she thought, the best investigations start when you least expect them. The parking ticket was still in her hand, but Sarah wasn't thinking about the fine anymore. She was thinking about all the others who had stood where she had stood, and how many of them had faced similar treatment without having the power or platform to do anything about it. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk in the Chicago Tribune office, surrounded by stacks of papers. Her computer screen showed dozens of open tabs, all court records from Judge Henderson's traffic court. She had been there since 6 a.m., her coffee cup already refilled 3 times. "This is interesting," she muttered to herself, making notes in her notebook. The numbers were starting to tell a story, and it wasn't a good one. According to the records, Judge Henderson's fines for minority defendants averaged 45% higher than those given to white defendants for the same violations. Mark Thompson, her editor, walked over to her desk. He was an old-school journalist with 30 years of experience and a strong sense of justice. "What have you found?" he asked, pulling up a chair. Sarah turned her computer screen toward him. "Look at these patterns," she said, pointing to her spreadsheet. "Last month alone, Judge Henderson handled 200 cases. In similar parking violations, white defendants paid an average fine of $150, while black and Hispanic defendants paid around $275. Mark leaned forward, his forehead wrinkled in concern. "Do you have more evidence?" Sarah nodded and pulled out her phone. "I recorded yesterday's entire session. It's legal in public courtrooms. Listen to how he speaks to different defendants." She played several clips, showing the stark difference in Judge Henderson's tone and patience levels. "There's more," Sarah continued, spreading out more papers. "I talked to Linda from the courthouse archives. She helped me find cases going back 5 years. The pattern isn't new, Mark. It's been happening for years, but nobody noticed because the differences in individual cases seemed small." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from a court clerk who had seen her in the courtroom yesterday. The message read, "Judge Henderson knows who you are now. He found out you're a reporter. He's not happy." Sarah showed the message to Mark. "This might make things more complicated," she said. "Or more interesting," Mark replied with a slight smile. "How you want to handle this?" Sarah thought for a moment, tapping her pen against her desk. "I need to talk to more people who've been through his courtroom. Get their stories, their experiences. Numbers are good, but real people make the story powerful." She pulled up another document on her computer. "I've already found 15 people willing to talk. All minorities who received unusually harsh fines. One woman lost her job because she couldn't pay the fine and then couldn't afford to drive to work." Mark nodded approvingly. "Be careful, though. Henderson has friends in high places. I've heard he plays golf with the police chief every weekend." Sarah stood up and grabbed her coat. "I'm meeting my first interview in an hour. A teacher who got fined $500 for a broken taillight. The same day, a white businessman paid $100 for the same violation." As she packed her bag, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Judge Henderson's office requesting a meeting to discuss yesterday's misunderstanding. She showed it to Mark. "He's trying to control the damage," Mark said. "What are you going to do?" "I'll meet him," Sarah replied, "but not yet. First, I need more evidence. More stories. He needs to know this isn't about my personal experience. It's about justice." Before leaving, Sarah made copies of all her documents. Years of investigative reporting had taught her to always have backups. She put one set in the office safe and another in her shoulder bag. As she walked to her car, Sarah thought about all the people who had stood in that courtroom, feeling helpless as they faced unfair treatment. Her simple parking ticket had opened the door to something much bigger, a story about power, prejudice, and the need for change in the justice system. Her phone buzzed one more time, another message from the court clerk. "Judge Henderson is making calls. Be careful." Sarah smiled slightly. She had dealt with powerful people trying to stop her stories before. It only made her more determined to uncover the truth. She got into her car and checked her notes for the address of her first interview. The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was waiting to tell her story, and Sarah was ready to listen, document, and expose the truth, no matter how powerful the people she was investigating might be. Mrs. Rodriguez's small apartment was neat and welcoming. She sat across from Sarah at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her eyes were tired but determined as she shared her story. "I paid $500 for a broken taillight," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, showing Sarah her court papers. "I'm a single mother teaching at Lincoln Elementary. That fine meant no new school supplies for my classroom that month." Sarah recorded the conversation and took careful notes. "And you saw someone else get a different fine that day?" she asked. "Yes." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded firmly. "A man in an expensive suit. Same violation. Judge Henderson was so polite to him, called him sir, and everything. His fine was only $100. As Sarah wrote this down, her phone buzzed. It was another text from the court clerk. Judge Henderson canceled all his cases for next week. He's meeting with lawyers. Sarah thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and left with copies of all her documents. This was her third interview today, and each story followed the same pattern. Outside, she checked her watch. 4:30 p.m. She had one more interview scheduled. 20 minutes later, Sarah parked outside a small barber shop owned by Mr. James, a black businessman who had appeared in Judge Henderson's court last month. The CLO's sign was on the door, but Mr. James was waiting inside. "I've kept all the paperwork," Mr. James told her, pulling out a folder. "Been running this shop for 15 years, never had any trouble until I got that parking ticket. Judge Henderson treated me like I was stupid, wouldn't even let me explain that the parking meter was broken." Sarah looked through his documents. $400 fine for an expired meter, she read aloud. "That seems unusually high." "The white lady right before me?" Mr. James shook his head. "Exact same thing, broken meter and all. She paid $125. Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mark, her editor. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said quickly. "Someone just sent us security camera footage from the courthouse parking lot. Shows Judge Henderson's car in a no parking zone yesterday, no ticket." Sarah's eyes widened. "Can we verify it's real?" "Already did. And there's more. Got an anonymous email with photos of Henderson at private dinners with real estate developers right before their parking violation cases. Always ruled in their favor." Sarah thanked Mr. James and rushed back to the Tribune office. The sun was setting as she walked through the parking lot, casting long shadows between the cars. She noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked nearby, but tried not to look nervous. In the office, Mark showed her the footage and photos. "This is bigger than traffic court," he said seriously. "These developers, they're connected to some powerful people in the city." Sarah nodded, spreading out her notes from today's interviews. "Look at these patterns," she said. "It's not just about race. Henderson's been using traffic court to help his friends and punish people he looks down on." Suddenly, Sarah's computer dinged with a new email. It was from Judge Henderson's private email address, not his official one. The subject line read, "Meeting request. Urgent." "Dear Ms. Mitchell," the email began, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to meet privately to discuss your recent court appearance and clear things up. Perhaps over dinner? My treat." Sarah showed the email to Mark. "He's trying to buy me off," she said quietly. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah started typing her reply. "Dear Judge Henderson, thank you for your invitation. I would be happy to meet with you in my office at the Chicago Tribune with my editor present. We have some questions about your sentencing patterns that we'd like to discuss." She hit send and looked at Mark. "We need to go through every case he's handled in the last 5 years, every single one." As they worked late into the night, more evidence kept coming in. Other journalists at the Tribune pitched in, helping to analyze data and documents. The story was growing bigger than anyone had expected. Sarah's phone buzzed one last time that night, another text from the court clerk. "Be careful. Henderson just left an angry message for the chief judge. Said he won't let some reporter ruin his reputation." Sarah smiled grimly. "Too late for that," she muttered, and went back to work. The truth was coming out, one document at a time. The following morning, Sarah arrived at her office to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit introduced himself as David Cooper, Judge Henderson's personal lawyer. "Miss Mitchell," he said smoothly, "I think we should talk about these allegations you're investigating." He held out a business card with gold lettering. Sarah took the card but kept her face neutral. Any statements from Judge Henderson should be made officially through the Tribune's legal department, she replied calmly, just as Mark appeared behind her. "Is there a problem here?" Mark asked, stepping forward. The lawyer smiled, but his eyes were cold. "No problem at all, just delivering a friendly message. Judge Henderson is a respected member of the legal community. It would be unfortunate if false accusations were made public." After the lawyer left, Sarah and Mark went straight to their investigation room. The walls were now covered with photos, documents, and charts showing Judge Henderson's pattern of discrimination. "They're getting nervous," Mark said, looking at the lawyer's card. "This means we're on the right track." Sarah nodded, then turned to her computer. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a new email. 5 more people came forward overnight, all with similar stories about Henderson's courtroom. One email caught her attention. It was from a former court clerk who had worked with Henderson 3 years ago. The message was short but powerful. "I have recorded conversations. The judge told us to process minorities differently. When can we meet?" Sarah immediately called the former clerk, Linda Martinez. They arranged to meet in a public park during lunch hour. Safety in public places had become important now that they knew they were being watched. At noon, Sarah sat on a park bench, pretending to eat a sandwich. Linda arrived wearing large sunglasses and carrying a folder. "I kept everything," Linda said quietly, handing over the folder. "Memos, notes, and recordings." Henderson was careful, but he made mistakes. He thought nobody would ever check. Inside the folder, Sarah found handwritten notes showing how Judge Henderson instructed clerks to put minority defendants at the end of the daily court schedule, making them wait longer. There were also notes about different fine amounts based on race and social status. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Sarah asked. Linda looked down. "I needed the job, but I secretly collected evidence, hoping someone would investigate someday. When I saw your name mentioned in the courthouse, I knew it was time." Back at the office, Sarah and Mark reviewed the new evidence. The recordings were clear. Henderson's voice giving instructions about treating different defendants differently. It was the smoking gun they needed. Suddenly, Sarah's computer screen went black. Then all the computers in the office shut down. "Server crash," the IT department announced. "Someone tried to hack our system." Sarah smiled. She had expected something like this. "Good thing we kept paper copies of everything," she said, patting the locked filing cabinet behind her desk. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez again. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone broke into my car last night. They went through all my papers, but I had already given you the important ones." Similar calls came in throughout the afternoon. Mr. James reported suspicious men watching his barbershop. Linda called to say her home had been randomly selected for a tax audit. "They're trying to scare our sources," Mark said, looking worried. Sarah stood up, determination in her eyes. "Then we need to move faster. Call the legal team. It's time to prepare the story for publication." As they worked, more evidence kept arriving. Other judges started sending anonymous tips about Henderson's behavior in private meetings. Police officers quietly shared stories about being pressured to target certain neighborhoods for traffic stops. At 6 p.m., Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Judge Henderson's office. This one was different. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement. Name your price." Sarah showed the message to Mark. They both knew it was an attempt to buy her silence. "Write it," Mark said firmly. "Write the story that needs to be told." Sarah nodded and began typing. The first line appeared on her screen. "In the halls of Chicago's traffic court, justice is not colorblind." Outside her office window, the same black SUV was still parked across the street. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was her protection, and she had more than enough of it now. The Chicago Tribune office was unusually quiet early Wednesday morning. Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing the final draft of her story for the 100th time. After 3 weeks of investigation, the truth about Judge Henderson was ready to be revealed. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, standing beside her desk with a cup of coffee. "Once we publish this, there's no going back." Sarah nodded, looking at the headline on her screen. "Justice for Sale: Discrimination and Corruption in Chicago Traffic Court." Below it were 5,000 words of carefully checked facts, supported by documents, recordings, and testimonies. Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Miss Mitchell," a deep voice said. "This is Chief Judge Wilson. Before you publish anything, I think we should meet. Judge Henderson has agreed to reduce your fine to $0. Sarah put the phone on speaker so Mark could hear. "Chief Judge Wilson, this story isn't about my fine anymore. It's about hundreds of people who were treated unfairly in your courts." You don't understand, the chief judge said, his voice getting harder. This story could damage the public's trust in our entire legal system. Maybe that trust needs to be damaged, Sarah replied firmly. Maybe it needs to be rebuilt on truth and fairness. After hanging up, Sarah looked at Mark. They're scared. They should be, Mark said, reviewing the evidence one last time. We have proof of Henderson taking bribes from those real estate developers. The recordings from Linda show him ordering different treatment based on race. The statistical analysis proves the pattern. Sarah's computer dinged with a new email. It was from Judge Henderson himself. The subject line read, "My side of the story." In the email, Henderson tried to explain everything away. He claimed the different fines were based on people's ability to pay. He said the meetings with developers were just friendly lunches. He even suggested that Sarah was targeting him because of her own parking ticket. Should we include his response? Sarah asked Mark. Yes, Mark decided. Let readers see how he tries to justify it. It makes our evidence even stronger. At 10 a.m., more visitors arrived at the Tribune office. This time it was representatives from the State Judicial Ethics Committee. They had heard rumors about the story and wanted to see the evidence. Sarah showed them everything, the statistics, the recordings, the patterns of discrimination. She played them Linda's recordings of Henderson giving different instructions for different defendants. This is very serious, one committee member said, taking notes. We'll need all copies of this evidence. They're already safely stored in multiple locations, Sarah replied. She had learned from experience to protect her sources and evidence. Just before noon, Judge Henderson made one last attempt. His lawyer arrived with a written statement and a check. The judge admits he may have shown poor judgment in some cases, the lawyer said smoothly. He's willing to make a generous donation to any charity of Ms. Mitchell's choice. Sarah didn't even look at the check. The story runs in 1 hour, she said firmly. At exactly 1 p.m., Sarah clicked Publish. Within minutes, the story was live on the Chicago Tribune's website. Her phone immediately started ringing with calls from other newspapers, TV stations, and radio shows. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Over 1,000 cases showing racial discrimination in fines. Audio recordings of Henderson instructing staff to treat minorities differently. Financial records showing connections between Henderson and developers. Testimonies from dozens of victims of his unfair practices. Statistical proof that minorities paid an average of 45% more in fines. By 2 p.m., the story had gone viral. Social media was exploding with people sharing their own experiences in Henderson's courtroom. Other news outlets were picking up the story, crediting the Tribune's investigation. Sarah watched as the story spread, thinking about all the people who had trusted her with their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, Linda, and many others. Their courage had helped expose the truth. Her phone buzzed one last time that afternoon. It was a text from the court clerk who had first warned her. Judge Henderson just walked out of the courthouse. He was asked to take a leave of absence pending investigation. You did it. Sarah smiled slightly, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a bigger conversation about justice and fairness in their city. The truth was out, and now it was time for change. The day after the story was published, Sarah arrived at work to find the Chicago Tribune office buzzing with activity. TV news vans lined the street outside, and her email inbox had over 1,000 new messages. You need to see this. Mark called her over to the break room where the morning news was playing on TV. Judge Henderson was holding a press conference on the courthouse steps. These allegations are completely false, Henderson was saying, his face red with anger. This reporter has a personal vendetta because of a simple traffic fine. I have served this community for 20 years with honor. Sarah watched quietly, taking notes. Just then, her phone rang. It was Linda Martinez, the former court clerk. They're trying to say I made up those recordings, Linda said, sounding worried. 2 men came to my house last night, saying they were from the judge's office. They wanted me to sign a statement saying the recordings were fake. Don't sign anything, Sarah told her firmly. We had those recordings verified by 3 different audio experts. The truth is on our side. Throughout the morning, more people began coming forward. A young intern from the courthouse emailed Sarah with screenshots of deleted emails showing Henderson's instructions about different fine amounts. A parking enforcement officer sent photos of tickets that had been mysteriously canceled for the judge's friends. At noon, the State Judicial Ethics Committee made their first public statement. Due to serious allegations supported by substantial evidence, Judge Robert Henderson has been suspended from his duties pending a full investigation. Sarah's phone kept ringing with calls from other news organizations. CNN wanted an interview. The New York Times was asking for permission to run a follow-up story. Local radio stations wanted her to speak about the investigation. "You should do some interviews," Mark suggested. "People need to hear from the person who uncovered this." But Sarah shook her head. "The story isn't about me," she said. "It's about the people Henderson hurt. Let's have them tell their stories." She arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, and other victims of Henderson's discrimination to speak to the media instead. Their stories were powerful and real, showing the human cost of judicial bias. By late afternoon, more developments were happening quickly. The FBI announced they were opening an investigation into Henderson's connections with real estate developers. 3 other judges who had worked closely with Henderson suddenly announced their early retirement. Civil rights organizations filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of minorities who had been unfairly fined. The city council called for a review of all traffic court procedures. At 4 p.m., Sarah received an unexpected visit from an elderly black woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Parker. "I've been keeping these for 30 years, Mrs. Parker said, placing a shoebox on Sarah's desk. Inside were hundreds of traffic court receipts from the 1990s, all showing the same pattern of discrimination. My husband used to say something wasn't right, but nobody would listen back then." Sarah carefully examined the old receipts. The yellowed papers told the same story. Different fines for different races, going back decades. This wasn't just Henderson, Sarah realized. This was a whole system that needed to be exposed. By evening, protests had formed outside the courthouse. People carried signs reading "Justice should be colorblind" and "Equal fines for equal violations." The crowd included people from all backgrounds, united in their demand for change. Sarah watched the protests from her office window. Her phone buzzed with a text from the court clerk who had first helped her. "Other clerks are coming forward now. Some judges are nervous. This is bigger than anyone thought." Mark walked over with 2 cups of coffee. "The FBI wants all our evidence," he said. "And the state Supreme Court just announced they're launching a wider investigation into racial bias in all traffic courts." Sarah nodded, thinking about how a simple parking ticket had led to all this. She opened her laptop and began typing again. There was more to this story, and she was going to follow it wherever it led. Sometimes, she thought, justice needs a little push to move forward. Her original story had been just the beginning. The real work of changing the system was just starting. 1 week after Sarah's story broke, the changes in Chicago's legal system were happening faster than anyone expected. She sat in a meeting room at the FBI's Chicago office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and 3 serious-looking federal agents. "Ms. Mitchell," the lead agent said, "your investigation opened a door we've been trying to crack for years. Judge Henderson was just the tip of the iceberg." Sarah looked at the documents spread across the table. The FBI had uncovered a network of corruption that went far beyond traffic court. Henderson had been working with property developers, helping them avoid millions in parking fines and building violations in exchange for secret payments. "We need your help," the agent continued. "Your sources trust you. Some of them are still afraid to talk to us directly." Back at the Tribune office, Sarah found more developments waiting. Mark met her with urgent news. "The state Supreme Court just called," he said excitedly. "They're forming a special commission to investigate racial bias in all Illinois courts. They want you to testify next month." Sarah nodded, then turned to her computer where new emails were pouring in. Linda Martinez had sent her more recordings, this time of private meetings between Henderson and other judges where they discussed their fine adjustment system. Mrs. Rodriguez called with news from her school. "The parents started a legal fund," she explained. "They're helping everyone who was unfairly fined to file for refunds. Even the school board is supporting us." Mr. James, the barbershop owner, reported that business was better than ever. "People come in just to talk about the story," he said. "Everyone has their own Henderson story to share. We're not afraid anymore." By afternoon, Sarah was reviewing security camera footage that someone had anonymously sent to the Tribune. It showed Judge Henderson meeting late at night with property developers in empty parking lots, accepting envelopes and shaking hands. "Look at this," she called to Mark. The footage showed dates and times matching perfectly with cases where wealthy developers had their violations mysteriously dismissed. Suddenly, Sarah's phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "Ms. Mitchell," a shaky voice said. "I'm Judge Henderson's former secretary. There's something you need to see. Can we meet?" Sarah met the secretary, Mary Wilson, in a quiet cafe. Mary's hands trembled as she pushed a USB drive across the table. "I kept backups of everything," Mary whispered. "Emails, calendar entries, private notes. He never thought his secretary would turn against him." The drive contained years of records showing how Henderson had built his discriminatory system. There were spreadsheets tracking fine amounts by race, notes about which developers needed special treatment, and lists of judges who were part of the scheme. When Sarah returned to the office, she found protesters still outside the courthouse, but now they were celebrating. The chief judge had just announced a complete overhaul of the traffic court system. New rules would require regular audits of fine amounts, mandatory bias training for all judges, and public reporting of fine statistics by race and income. "Your story did this," Mark said proudly, showing her the announcement. But Sarah was already focused on the next phase. The evidence from Mary, combined with the FBI's investigation, pointed to corruption beyond Chicago. Other cities were showing similar patterns. "This isn't just about traffic court anymore," she told Mark. "It's about how justice works, or doesn't work, for different people across the country." Late that evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Judge Henderson's clerk. "He's gone. Cleaned out his office tonight. Left for his lake house in Michigan. FBI is following him." Sarah smiled slightly. Henderson might be running, but the truth was already out. His system of discrimination and corruption was falling apart, piece by piece. As she packed up her notes, Sarah thought about all the people who had trusted her with their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, Linda, Mary, and countless others. Their courage had helped expose not just one corrupt judge, but an entire system that needed to change. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest stories start with the smallest moments. Her parking ticket had been unfair, but it had led to something much bigger. A chance to make justice a little more equal for everyone. 3 months after Sarah's first article, she stood in the back of a packed courtroom. This time, it wasn't traffic court. It was the federal courthouse, and Judge Henderson was the one facing judgment. The former judge looked smaller now in his regular clothes, without his black robe and high bench. His face was pale as the federal prosecutor read the charges: corruption, discrimination, accepting bribes, and obstruction of justice. "How does the defendant plead?" the federal judge asked. "Guilty, Your Honor," Henderson replied quietly. His voice shook slightly. Sarah watched from her spot near the door, taking notes. Next to her sat Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, and several others who had been victims of Henderson's discrimination. They had all come to see justice finally being served. Outside the courthouse, reporters from national news networks were setting up their cameras. Sarah's story had grown far beyond Chicago. Similar investigations were now happening in 12 other cities across the country. "The defendant has agreed to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations," the prosecutor announced. "His testimony will help us identify others involved in this corruption network." After the hearing, Sarah walked back to the Tribune office with Mark. The spring air felt fresh and clean, like a new beginning. "You've got some visitors waiting," the receptionist told her with a smile. In the conference room, Sarah found Linda Martinez, Mary Wilson, and several other whistleblowers who had helped expose the truth. They had brought a cake with "thank you" written on it. "We heard about the Journalism Award," Linda said, hugging Sarah. The Pulitzer Committee had announced their decision yesterday. Sarah's investigation had won for public service journalism. But the real reward wasn't the prize. It was the changes happening in the justice system. The state had reviewed over 100,000 old traffic cases. More than $15 million in unfair fines were being refunded. New anti-discrimination rules were being implemented in courts statewide. 5 other corrupt judges had resigned or been removed. The FBI's investigation had expanded to other states. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was an email from Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman with 30 years of receipts. She had started a community group helping people appeal their old traffic fines. "Your story gave people hope," Mrs. Parker wrote. "Now they know someone will listen when they speak up." Later that afternoon, Sarah visited Mr. James's barbershop. The place was busy, and a framed copy of her first article hung on the wall. "Business is good," Mr. James said proudly. "People say they trust me because I helped expose the truth. Even got some new customers from the suburbs." As Sarah walked back to her car, she passed the courthouse where it had all started. The protesters were gone now, replaced by new signs announcing reforms. Equal justice under law and new traffic court guidelines in effect. Her phone rang. It was the state Supreme Court Chief Justice. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "the Judicial Reform Committee has finished its work. Would you be willing to write about the changes we're implementing? The public trusts your reporting." Back at her desk, Sarah looked at the small frame Mark had given her. Inside was her original parking ticket, the one that had started it all. Next to it was a quote she had written. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest injustices." "Ready for your next story?" Mark asked, dropping a new file on her desk. "We've got tips about similar problems in the housing courts." Sarah smiled and opened her laptop. One story had ended, but the work of protecting justice was never really finished. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Sarah received one final text from the court clerk who had first helped her. "Just heard Henderson is going to serve 5 years. The other judges are pleading guilty too. You really did it." Sarah looked out her office window at the city lights. Chicago wasn't perfect, but it was a little more just today than it had been 3 months ago. All because one reporter had gotten an unfair parking ticket and decided to ask questions. Sometimes, she thought, that's all it takes. One person willing to stand up and expose the truth. The rest, as her story had shown, was history.